Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the effects of chronic stress on captive orcas. I am Lori Marino, and I will be your moderator. I am a neuroscientist who has studied the brains of dolphins and whales for over 30 years now, and I'm also the president of the Whale Sanctuary Project. I've published over 140 papers on whale and dolphin neuroanatomy, intelligence, and brain evolution, as well as on their welfare in captive environments. I am very pleased to be joined by Dr. Naomi Rose and Dr. Veronica Slootsky. Dr. Rose is a marine mammal biologist who works for the Animal Welfare Institute in Washington, D.C. And she's been a marine mammal protection advocate for over 25 years. One of her focuses is on campaigning against cetacean capture, live capture, trade, and captivity. Her work on this was featured in the 2012 book, Death at SeaWorld, by journalist David Kirby, and her doctoral dissertation examined the social dynamics of free-ranging orcas in British Columbia. Welcome. Dr. Veronica Slootsky is a practicing adult psychiatrist who has 9 years of experience working with individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. In addition to her regular clinical practice, she has worked with diverse populations such as survivors of the Khmer Rouge genocide and Latin American female survivors of domestic violence. She's also a PADI dive master and has been a supporter of programs that use scuba diving to treat injured war veterans. Welcome. Welcome to all of you. Hope all of you are well. I'd like to begin by giving you a very brief description of our stress study before we get started on some of the specifics. Some housekeeping notes. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. We have many people registered, over 500 people registered, and so we may not get to all of them, but we will try to get to as many as we can in the latter half of this webinar. So this webinar is based upon a study we published in early 2020 in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior. We co-authored the paper with Drs. Ingrid Visser, Dr. Heather Rowley, and Dr. Hope Ferdosian. And this was really a unique collaboration of experts across many fields, the fields of marine mammal science, veterinary science, internal medicine, and psychiatry. This convergence of knowledge allowed us not only to cross-validate our arguments across disciplines, but also gain insights we would not necessarily gain from a more homogeneous group. In this paper, we reviewed the data on various parameters of well-being in captive orcas, orcas living in concrete tanks in marine parks, with the goal of finding a neurobiological mechanism that best explains these features of captive orca welfare that we know to be problematic. And we found that the data on orca welfare best fit, in other words, can be best explained by the well-known impacts of chronic stress on the brain, physiology, and behavior. In our paper, we outline this model and discuss its relevance to orca welfare. In addition, we identify 5 key sources of major chronic stress for orcas held in tanks, and we will discuss these in more detail shortly. Our overall goal for this paper was to propose a plausible and testable model which can drive empirical investigation and open dialogue on captive cetacean welfare. So In the first half of this webinar, we will be discussing the different elements of the paper, from time to time sharing a screen with you. And then in the second half, we will respond to as many questions of yours as we can. And again, you can submit them in the Q&A section. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. Okay, and we're going to get started with a real brief description of who orcas are. Naomi, why don't you start?
So we're talking about orcas, also known as killer whales. Their scientific name is Orcinus orca, where one of their common names comes from. A lot of people are surprised to learn that they're the largest dolphin. They're of the family of Delphinidae, so they're very closely related to bottlenose dolphins and a number of other species that belong in this family. But they're the largest dolphin. And they're the only dolphin of which we're aware that feeds on other marine mammals, although there are populations that also feed exclusively on fish. And these various populations have different cultures, different ecologies, and in fact, different appearances, although to most people, they all look like black and white orcas. So they range in size from 18 to 30 feet. I mean, there's the small orcas, and then there's some populations that get larger. And in the populations with larger animals, they can weigh up to 8 tons, which is a big animal. There's lots of sexual dimorphism. Females have smaller pectoral fins and smaller dorsal fins. Males have almost 6 feet tall, 5 to 6 feet tall dorsal fins, and pectoral fins that are like the size of dinner tables. So that's the basic anatomy and some of the basic ecology. There are populations that live well offshore, travel great distances, have very huge territories, and then there's populations that have smaller territories, smaller home ranges. It just is all across the board. There's just a great deal of variety in the orca genus. And there are some taxonomists who think they should have different species. You know, they should be broken down into different species. And then I'll let Lori talk about their amazing brain.
Well, thank you. So the brains of orcas are indeed amazing. And
that comes from having studied a lot of brains in my lifetime, but also in looking at the various parts of the brain that are measurable. The orca brain weighs about 11 pounds and is about 2.5 times larger than you'd expect even for a large animal like an orca. So they are very highly encephalized. There are a couple of features of the orca brain that really stand out. One is that the orca brain is the most gyrified brain on the planet, meaning that all those wrinkles you see on the surface means that they've had a lot of neocortex stuffed into their cranium over the course of evolution. In fact, it is a more gyrified brain than our own. Also, the orca brain has the largest neocortex in proportion to the total brain mass. And the neocortex is the part of the brain that is thought to be involved in things like problem solving, analysis, and cognition. That is, the neocortex of the orca brain takes up more of the total brain mass than even the human brain. So they are more neocorticalized than us.
So from these objective measures, we can see that the orca brain is really extraordinary in a lot of ways. So with that, I'd like to get started talking about the welfare in marine parks. And Naomi is going to start us off with a discussion of survivorship and longevity and some of the behavioral problems and mortality issues that we have in the tanks.
So I hope I don't also have recording problems. If either Lori or Veronica can sort of wave at me if that develops, because I can't see the chat feature at the moment. All right, so the slide you're looking at right now is the most recent data, which 2 papers were published in 2015 to address the issue of survivorship of captive orcas versus wild orcas. And I understand that generally speaking, these comparisons are difficult to make for a lot of species because we don't necessarily have good data from the wild. But in the case of orcas, we do have a couple of very well-studied populations, primarily in Canada and the Pacific Northwest off of British Columbia. But we also are starting to get some data from a couple of other populations, but it's nowhere near as long a data set as the one from British Columbia and Washington State, which started in the early 1970s. So we have a nice long data set there. And because they're actually very easy to follow with photo identification, we have very comprehensive and complete data sets for these populations. We pretty much know every individual in them, and we can identify them every year. And so we can follow them from birth to death as time has gone on. So what we have here are just selected data from a couple of papers. One shows that survivorship to milestones, sexual maturity, and menopause, which is an unusual feature in orcas and human beings for that matter. It's not something that's common in the animal kingdom. Is much better in the wild than it is in captivity. And in fact, there are very few females, as you see from from this table, that actually reach what we call reproductive senescence in captivity. There are a few. We definitely have some, what I would call elderly females still living in captivity, but it's a small number compared to the number that there could have been. And then interestingly, another study also published in 2015, and you see the references at the bottom there, noted that looking at a smaller subset of captive orcas, the first study looked at all captive orcas that have ever been held in various facilities around the world, but the second study at the bottom there just looked at those at one facility. And what it noted was that the survivorship rates in captivity are comparable to that of populations in the Northeastern Pacific, the ones I've just mentioned. And both of those populations are either endangered under US law or threatened in Canadian law. And I find that very interesting because basically it suggests to me that captivity has impacts on longevity and survivorship that are very similar to whatever is causing endangered or threatened status in the wild. So this slide illustrates a number of issues that we have tried to follow over the years in captive orcas. I will say at the outset that some of what we know about the impacts of captivity on orcas is limited because access to medical records and necropsy reports and those sorts of primary data sets is limited. The facilities that hold these animals restrict access to these primary data sets. And so they do publish some in the literature, but not as much as you might think they could, given that they got data from about 1965. So, but as you can see, there are problems with systemic illnesses and infections, some of which are seen in the wild, but what's interesting to me is it seems that they can be more deadly in captivity, probably because of chronic stress affecting their immune response. You also see some common signs of psychological disturbance, basically stereotypies, which are what you would see, for example, in a tiger pacing in front of its cage. Well, you'll see this in orcas as well, but it's circling behavior, repetitive circling behavior. You will also see self-mutilation, as you can see in this photograph, and I'll show you another one in a second. They grind their teeth down. And then you'll also see some abnormal behaviors, hyperaggression. It's difficult for a subordinate animal, for example, to escape a dominant animal in a small tank versus in the wild where they have 3 dimensions to escape in and basically an entire coastal body of water to avoid escalation of aggression. And I've seen aggression in the wild, and I've seen the avoidance behaviors that these animals exhibit, they leave the scene before aggression can escalate to dangerous levels. But that's not possible in a tank. And then you also will see poor parenting, failure to thrive. The photograph on this slide is of Can-Do, a whale who was basically so aggressive to another whale, Corky, that she broke her own jaw by ramming Corky, and she severed an artery and she bled out, which is not an injury you're likely to see in the wild. And again, in these very well-studied populations, we've certainly never seen this sort of aggressive escalation during the summer seasons when we're observing them on a daily basis. So the next slide's gonna look a little bit more at the dentition problem that these animals suffer. This is a resident orca in the Pacific Northwest, the well-studied population I was just talking about. These are fish eaters. This animal is dead. It's a stranded animal from, I think, the 70s, maybe even the 80s, but from a while ago. And what you see here are what their teeth normally look like. It's perfectly normal for them to have no teeth near the front of their jaws, but their teeth in the back of their jaws, along the sides and into the back, are these really beautiful conical teeth that, generally speaking, might show a little bit of wear along the sides over a lifetime, but they remain big, tall, and quite fearsome. It's one of the reasons they have the reputation they have and were known as killer whales. But this is perfectly normal. You'll see this kind of dentition in an ancient whale of 50, 60, 70, 80 who's washed up on shore. Their teeth will look just like this. It's extremely rare for them to break their teeth, and it's even more rare for them to wear them. There are a couple of populations that do show extreme wear on the teeth, but it's a function of how they feed. Tooth wear is a function of ecology in orcas, and I think that's a really important point to hold in your memory there. These are captive orcas. The one on the top there is actually Tillicum, and as you can see, as in the other photo I showed on the previous slide, ground his teeth down to the gum and exposed the pulp. This is probably done through grinding their teeth on the concrete walls, or in the case of the whale on the bottom right, breaking their teeth on the metal gates. All of the teeth on the lower right jaw there, pretty much all of them except the two near the back, are broken. And again, the teeth in the very front of the lower jaw are exposing the pulp, which is as painful is as painful for them as it is for us, as you can imagine. You can't fill in these cavities. These are aquatic animals. It's impossible to perform that kind of dental work on them. It would just wash out before it hardened, and so they basically have to clean out these open wounds, is what I would call them, every day. It does lead, we believe, and again, Lori will talk a little bit more about this, to increase susceptibility to disease, because bad teeth is basically equivalent to bad health for every mammal we know of, for your cat, for your dog, for us. You have bad dentition, worn teeth, broken teeth, open teeth, you're going to have bad health. Again, this is not necessarily unknown in the wild. There are some populations that, because of the way they feed, they wear their teeth down, but it probably has similar health effects on them, and their lives are probably shorter. And one of the biggest differences in the way they wear their teeth is the asymmetry of it. Both of the upper and the lower jaw teeth will be worn in a wild whale that shows extreme wear because of the way they feed. But in captivity, it's pretty much just the bottom teeth. The upper row of teeth isn't involved in whatever neurotic behavior is causing this dentition problem. So what you have here are these top marine predators. These are animals that are basically the top of the food chain. And one of my favorite questions from young kids is always, between a great white shark and an orca, who would win? And I always tell them it would be the orca, because they're both fearsome predators. They're both top predators, but the orca has a brain. And sharks aren't totally stupid, but they've got these little brains and they don't do much thinking. They're just sort of instinctive killing machines. So what you have is, in this photograph, is two different examples of hunting with thought, right? They're planning, they're thinking about how they're going to do this. They train to do this. The whale on the left in particular, which is hunting in Patagonia, beaching themselves to pull seal pups off the beach is a risky foraging behavior, and they have to learn how to do this. We've actually seen adults training the juveniles to do this. But in captivity, that, which is, in my opinion, sort of their job, It's their job to hunt like this. It's taken away from them, and all they do is solicit fish by opening their mouth and looking up at the sky where the fish drop in. So again, if tooth wear in wild whales is a result of their foraging, the way they eat, that's clearly not the problem in captivity, because fish just drop into their open mouths and go down their gullet, and their teeth never are involved. And so whatever is wearing their teeth down is something else besides foraging, and it's from what we can see, we can actually observe this, it's neurotically grinding their teeth down on the walls and on the gates. So those are some of the impacts. But what we're going to discuss now are these key sources of what we believe is chronic stress in these animals. And these are the 5 things that we discuss in our paper. And I'm going to start by talking about confinement as being a source of stress, and then Lori will take over from there. So here we go. Space is like really important to these animals. They are wide-ranging predators. And in a meta-analysis of wide-ranging predators that was published in Nature a few years ago, it's very clear that such wildlife species suffer the most in captivity. You know, when you restrict the movement of an animal that has evolved to be a wide-ranging predator, you are, as I said, you're taking away the job that they're supposed to do. And just as we become couch potatoes in the modern world and suffer for that, because we evolved as hunter-gatherers. So if we don't, you know, if we're not as active as we were when we were hunter-gatherers, we become couch potatoes. We end up with coronary disease and, you know, high blood pressure and diabetes, and all these problems affect all mammals who don't get the exercise they evolutionarily need. So as you can see from the data, they are incredibly wide-ranging predators. They can move, they're dynamic, they move all the time, they even move when they're sleeping. And they dive, they go down to great depths, and they can tolerate those great depths. And again, the references that I pulled these data from are there up on the screen, and I can, and you will see them if you go and look at the recording afterwards. This is a graphic I find really compelling. This is a dive track of an animal that had a tag on him. He's a large adult male in the Pacific Northwest. This is from Cascadia Research Collective. The dive track from left to right is 5 minutes or so long. He goes down to about 160 meters, which is over 500 feet. He does something down there. He's not just going down there and logging or resting. He's actually chasing a fish is probably what he's doing. He's down there foraging. Then he comes back up. So this is just one dive. He'll do a dive like this going down to over 500 feet, probably several times a day. And in between, he's moving horizontally. He'll go to shallower depths, again, multiple times a day. And by shallower, I mean, look at this graph, 150 feet or 300 feet. That's a more shallow dive. And as you saw on the previous slide, you know, a 20 to 30 foot dive is very, very shallow. But that's all they have in captivity is 20 to 30 feet. That, and I hope you can see the cursor, the rectangular blue box up here in the corner of the graph is to scale. That's the tank complex at a facility that's known for having one of the largest tank complexes for orcas, and up to 10 animals are held in that tank complex. So that's all they have 24/7, 365, whereas this dive you see here of this Pacific Northwest whale is just a single dive he did one average day. So we are taking away an enormous amount of their space by putting them in captivity. And again, it's just common sense that when you do that to a species that is evolved, is adapted for traveling great distances to hunt, to forage, to do their job, then that's going to cause a problem. And again, it happens in all mammal species, including human beings. We have health problems when we don't exercise. So, you know, we have reduced their natural home range by 1/10,000th of a percent. We've taken away, you know, almost everything they need in terms of space. And this is just an example of that. This is an extreme example. It happens to be in the United States, but it's a Lolitas tank at the Miami Seaquarium, which, despite it not actually being legal, has avoided any kind of legal ramifications for the facility because she was put in this tank in 1970. And one of the interesting things I've heard in the past is that well, she's been in this tank since 1970. How can it be bad for her? But the fact is that another whale was with her, Hugo. She didn't used to be alone. And can you imagine 2 orcas in this space? I can't really. He died in 1980, and he had probably had a brain aneurysm, and he basically smashed himself against the wall and burst it and died. So this is not something that necessarily is survivable for all orcas. I just think that Lolita is particularly robust physically. I don't know about her mental state at this point anymore because she's alone, because she's in such a small place. But this is really not suitable. And I don't think anybody would build a tank like this today. Again, she was put into this tank in 1970. But the fact that this is considered legal in the United States is disturbing all the same. So I will now pass it on to Lori, and she'll talk about the others. So I will stop sharing my screen.
So what I'd like to do now is turn to Dr. Slootsky, who can talk about the basic effects of chronic stress on the brain and body, as there are a number of questions about these mechanisms that we've identified. And then if we have time, we can go back to the 5 major sources of chronic stress in captive orcas. I can continue.
Yes, I have to apologize. I messed up, guys. So just sorry about that. It's my bad. I went too fast, too far before Veronica had a chance.
Okay, so Veronica, why don't you go ahead and share your screen?
Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the stress response. I see there's already a lot of questions about that, so hopefully I can clarify a few things. So the body's stress response, and I'm going to talk about humans and other mammals like orcas and other mammals in general when I talk about body, the individual and whatnot. The stress response probably evolved to deal with sudden stressors in nature, usually short-term, life-threatening situations, and it helps us use our stored energy for immediate use. And it's useful for situations such as being attacked by a tiger, or for example, these 2 battling warthogs in Tanzania. And in this case, the system is functioning as it should, and it's going to shut down when this fight is done, and they can go back to quality time with Timon and Simba and enjoy their spacious habitat in the Tarangire National Park in Tanzania. So although the stress response helps animals and humans deal with these sudden stressors, constant activation of this system can be a problem and cause poor mental and physical health. And that can happen, for example, if an animal or human is kept in stressful or unnatural conditions. And in fact, it's estimated that something like 75% to 90% of human diseases are related to improper activation of this stress system. So what causes a normal and an abnormal stress response? So this is the biological basis for the stress response in mammals. And it's an interconnected system called the HPA axis. And it connects 2 glands in the brain, hypothalamus right here, and the pituitary. And when we experience something stressful, the hypothalamus gland releases a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, which then goes down to the pituitary, also in the brain, and it tells it to secrete a hormone called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this hormone goes all the way down the body to the adrenal glands. And down here, they sit on the kidneys. And it tells them to do various things, many various things. One of the things it tells them to do is to release cortisol, a hormone that plays an important role in the stress response. And it helps the body deal with stress, mobilize energy. It also triggers the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine and epinephrine trigger the fight or flight response, and they keep the body vigilant and increase blood flow to the muscles to prepare for fighting or running. And they make the heart beat faster. And they do other various things if they're constantly being released, and we'll talk about that later. So in nature, this response is not meant to last forever. Once the fight is done, there needs to be a way to shut it off. So when the cortisol level goes up, it comes back to the brain and shuts this whole thing down. It's called a negative feedback loop. However, with chronic stress, and actually in human individuals with PTSD, we often see that cortisol levels can be low. And so the negative feedback loop seems to be broken in certain situations and never turned off. And the system can continue to be activated in an abnormal way when it's always activated. And again, I want to reiterate that this system is common to all mammals, including mice, and it's studied in mice, and we'll talk about that as well. So I'd like to discuss also cytokines, and it's another biochemical system that's affected by the HPA axis that we just discussed. And the stress response induces immune system cells to make biochemicals called cytokines, and they're involved with the inflammation response in the body to infection. You might have heard about the cytokine storm with COVID-19, which is when the system gets overwhelmed when it's fighting the infection. And they're also involved with chronic diseases such as heart disease and autoimmune disease, and even mental health disorders such as depression. And some examples can include interleukin-6, which is involved with depression, cancer, and heart disease, and TNF-alpha, which is involved with cancer. And the key point is that they might be useful for acting in the short term to fight infections, but can be dangerous for physical and mental health in the long term if their balance becomes abnormal. So in our Western culture, we often think about mental and physical health as separate, but they're not. And these neurochemicals can change the way our body processes information, but it can also affect our immune system and trigger mental and physical health problems. And as you can see from this chart, these chemicals, when they're off balance, are linked to a wide array of human diseases, including hypertension, cancers, heart disease, diabetes, depression, even Parkinson's disease. And inflammation is also involved with many chronic illnesses. And this might be why patients with PTSD seem to have a higher risk of developing these illnesses. And as I mentioned earlier, these systems are shared among animals, mammals, other mammals, and humans. And these two photos are of the same cat. This is my recent foster cat who just got adopted. Congratulations to her. And on the right, you see a photo of her when she first came, when she was not acclimated yet to my house. And her HPA axis is activated, and norepinephrine and epinephrine are causing her pupils to dilate. She was stressed due to being in a new environment. And on the photo on the left-hand side, she feels comfortable. Her pupils are no longer dilated, and the HPA axis has shut off. Epinephrine is no longer active. So as you can see, this is quite common in other mammals. And in fact, animal models have already been used to study the effects of chronic stress as well. There was an experiment where a group of mice were stressed by keeping them in enclosures that limited their movement, and then they were injected with cancer stem cells. Some of the mice were then moved to an open enclosure with plenty of room, and some continued to experience chronic stress as they were kept in a small enclosure. And the mice experiencing chronic stress showed behavioral changes to indicate that they were stressed. And very important, they also had bigger and faster growing tumors and more cancer stem cells than the mice that were moved to the large enclosure. So we can see that chronic stress does have an effect on other mammals as well. So this was a quick summary, and I just wanted to highlight these points and turn it back over to Lori, and we'll discuss this further down the road.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Veronica. Since I cannot share my screen and talk at the same time because there's some technological issue, I'm wondering if Naomi, do you have slides to share?
Yes, I do. I can share my screen. Let me do that and see if
Okay,
that
thank
helps
you.
you and your.
And I will make this quick since we want to have time for discussion.
All right, let me do this, folks. Okay, there it is. Hang on.
So these are, we mentioned that we identified several chronic stressors that occur in captivity. And I want to, Naomi talked about confinement. I want to talk about the last few, and then we can turn the webinar open to discussion. So in addition to confinement, obviously one of the issues for orcas in captivity is loss of social support. You know, as highly social mammals, they depend upon healthy and robust relationships for proper development. As with most highly social species, the mother-calf relationship is very, very important. And just as in all mammals, including humans, disruption of this relationship can have lifelong consequences. But living in what is at best an artificial social setting that involves human intervention, many orcas do not get adequate care and psychological support and their long juvenile period. And they either fail to thrive or they grow into adults who then lack the skills to be good parents themselves. And so this becomes somewhat of a cycle of dysfunction, which is activity. Next slide. Acoustic disturbance. That these are extremely sensitive animals, and there are lots of things that happen at marine parks that can be disruptive and cause chronic stress to the animals. Mechanical and other human caused sounds and vibrations, water pumps, fireworks, the audience, roller coasters, you name it. And in fact, a 2017 paper showed that cortisol levels became elevated over 300 times in bottlenose dolphins housed in a facility where there was nearby construction. So exposure to excessive or unnatural levels or types of acoustic input can cause a number of impacts to cetaceans. And it's been documented, and you can see some of the papers there. Some of those impacts include reduced reproductive success, accelerated aging, suppression of the immune system, and premature hearing loss. Next slide. So this is one that a lot of people have asked about, and it's not something you would immediately think of or know if you went to see an animal on display, and this is loss of autonomy and lack of control. When any captive animals, and again, this is a highly conserved psychological phenomenon, when any captive animals are not allowed to carry out basic species-specific functions, or they are unable to exert choice about what to do in a given day, or are unable to escape aversive situations they suffer from, then what you have is a classic stress response. Long-standing evidence shows that unpredictable and uncontrollable experiences lead to a syndrome called learned helplessness, which results in a range of outcomes associated with chronic stress. And again, this is across the board in mammals. This includes depression, giving up or lack of motivation to learn, cognitive deficits, anorexia, and once again, immune system dysfunction. So learned helplessness has been documented across a range of mammals in captivity, and some authors have noted that captive cetaceans often exhibit symptoms that are consistent with learned helplessness. And this includes extended periods of logging and immobility, catatonic like bottom resting behaviors, and so forth. Next slide, please.
Hang on.
Next slide, please. And finally, boredom, something we are all probably experiencing as we deal with this pandemic crisis. And Boredom occurs when there's not enough variety or even challenge in an environment. And this reduces the motivation to do anything really. It's a deeply unpleasant psychological state, and it's expressed as impaired attention, listlessness, irritability, and the frequency of self-stimulatory behaviors, as Naomi talked about. Orcas and cetaceans in general, and this is a very important point, are highly vulnerable to boredom in concrete tanks because the brain that I described to you earlier on, that has all these amazing features, is adapted to dealing with challenges and complex problems and variety. So their very intellect is actually something that makes them highly susceptible to chronic boredom. And studies comparing the behavior of captive dolphins in even open facilities like sea pens, where they're in the ocean, some fish can swim through, and so forth, have less stress, lower salivary cortisol levels than those that are kept in concrete tanks. So just the simple act of putting the animals into the ocean water seems to alleviate some of the boredom and the chronic stress that they deal with. So our conclusions, and then we'll go through this really quickly. In this paper, we presented evidence that orcas are not well suited to life in concrete tanks because they are intelligent, socially complex, and cultural. We identified 5 major stressors: confinement, lack of social support, sensory disturbance, loss of autonomy, and boredom. And we've shown that these data are best explained by the well-known general mammalian model of chronic stress and its impacts on brain physiology and behavior. Our take-home message is that we need to come together to transform this knowledge into providing better settings for captive orcas. One way we can do that is an ongoing discussion throughout the marine mammal community, is combining the natural environment and human care in a win-win situation for the animals, what's known as a sanctuary. This is a model that's been successful for all other highly intelligent, large, and socially complex mammals, can be successful for orcas and other cetaceans as well. We'll now throw the floor open for questions. So I am going to, a lot of questions here, and we're not going to get to all of them, obviously, but I'm going to start from the beginning. One question is from Mishka. What kind of abnormalities on the paralimbic system could you see during necropsy or post-mortem or neuroanatomy examination of a captive orca's brain? And has this ever been done? So this is referring to the paralimbic system, the highly developed part of the orca brain that connects the limbic and the supralimbic regions. And it's, what kinds of abnormalities would we expect? Well, we would expect perhaps differences in volume, cell counts, shape, morphological aspects of that lobe. It could even present itself as changes in connectivity. The problem is that we don't have the material to take that hypothesis to the next level and really get a large enough sample size to look at any part of the brain, or especially the paralimbic system in captive animals, because those materials aren't they're not forthcoming. We would love to be able to do these kinds of studies. Let's see. Uh, one question is, and this could be for Naomi, what do you mean that tooth wear is related to ecology?
There are two populations which we know in Iceland, the North Atlantic, I should say. They don't just live in Iceland. They travel throughout the North Sea and throughout the North Atlantic. And they do show tooth wear. In one case, right down to the gum. They over the course of a lifetime, they wear their teeth right down to the gums. Although they don't necessarily expose the pulp, which I find very interesting. And apparently the reason this happens is because it's not through a grinding process, it's through an erosion process. As you all probably know, water is an amazing force over time. That's how the Grand Canyon was formed, simply because Colorado River made it. And so there are some cetaceans, including orcas in the North Atlantic, who feed through suction feeding. They suck the fish into their mouth. They don't actually ever grab it with their teeth out of the water column. They literally zero in on it with their etholocation, and they just pull their tongue in like a piston and suck the fish right into their mouth. And that causes water to rush past their teeth, with great force, over and over and over again, just in one day, let alone in a lifetime. And over time, apparently, for those orcas, and probably for some other species that have worn teeth by the end of life, it wears their teeth down. And so it's not a function of, rubbing their teeth on anything. It's just because of the way they feed, by sucking individual fish out of the water column. And then in another case, it may be because of abrasive prey, and this is the offshores in the Pacific Northwest, although in the case of known predation on sharks in New Zealand, they don't show this tooth wear. So we actually don't know very much about the offshore. So this is just a guess on the part of the researchers who noted this difference. And so basically you have some orcas show almost no wear. They live and die with beautiful, conical teeth that are quite sharp throughout life. You have some orcas with mild wear, because of the way they feed or what they feed on. It over the course of a lifetime, their teeth wear. And then you have some orcas with extreme wear, all of which are related to ecology, the way they feed or what they feed on. And my point was simply that this seems to be the case in captivity, that it's related to their ecology, but it's not because of what they feed on. Their teeth often never touch their food at all. It's because of what they do when they're in a tank, which is chew on the walls or on the gates. And again, you can observe that. It's easy to observe. And the asymmetry of the tooth wear is a function of how they wear their teeth. In the wild, both the upper and the lower teeth wear at the same rate because they're sucking water past their teeth. Doesn't matter which part of the jaw they're in. But in captivity, they're chewing with their bottom jaw, and it just wears their teeth there. They don't tend to wear their upper teeth.
I have another question here from Jordan, and this is one that perhaps Naomi and Veronica could address. In your professional opinions, is the administration of psychopharmaceuticals to captive orcas an appropriate treatment method for these animals? And how much precedent is there for administering drugs like anxiolytics designed to treat mental disorders in humans to non-human mammals? So this is referring to the not uncommon practice of giving anti-anxiety drugs that have been used by humans and other animals to orcas in captivity, and what kind of judgment does that show, and whether or not is that something that might be based upon some helpful advice or sound evidence. So why don't we go to Naomi, and then Veronica, if you want to say anything about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, and not being, a veterinarian or anybody who's, anybody who has any experience with, that sort of drug administration, I'd rather leave that to Veronica, because I know some, in some facilities, they do administer things like Xanax or Zoloft type medications, but I know very little about it because, again, I have to emphasize, we do not have access to the records. We being the general research community or the general activist community or the general public. Those data are considered proprietary and they are not made widely available to outside researchers. And there's very little published in the literature. So, Veronica.
Yeah, again, I'm also not a veterinarian, so I cannot speak to this particular situation, what is given to orcas, but I can tell you that many psychotropic medications are tested on animals when they're in development. And like I said, we do have a common pathway. So I would imagine that a lot of these psychotropic medications might be psychoactive in other species.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to question, going back a little bit to try to pick up some of the earlier questions. Humans have health problems when they don't exercise, but that exercise doesn't need to be walking. So isn't the issue about giving the whales exercise rather than about space specifically? And so the question is, well, if there's not enough space in a tank for orcas to exercise, is there some other way that they can exercise and stay in physiological shape without the space? Anyone want to take that? I mean, it seems to me that limited space, but we don't have treadmills for orcas.
Yeah, I could speak to it a little bit. So, exercise is very much connected to mental health, but it's only one aspect of mental health, of course. And with human beings, exercise can actually help prevent and treat depression, mild depression to moderate depression. However, you can't ask an animal to go on a treadmill. It's an animal. It's a little bit it's different. So I think it's hard to substitute like a gym, so to speak, for a wild natural habitat. For humans, even for humans, a lot of folks they don't want to work out in a gym. They want to be outside. They want to be kind of in a more natural situation. And in that case, they're not able to get the benefits of exercise because it's crowded, whatever the reason is. And I think that it's going to be difficult to replicate what's naturally supposed to happen with the animal.
And I think Veronica makes a good point. This is not just about exercise, being on a treadmill or a hamster wheel or something, because it's psychological. It's about being able to go somewhere, to explore somewhere, to change the scenery, if you will. Those kinds of things are not doable in concrete tanks. So you could devise, they could swim in circles 1,000 times a day around the edge of the tank, which a lot of them do, but that doesn't change the fact that, nothing changes for them. So there are physiological impacts, there are mental impacts, and all of those things interact together. Let's see. Any more questions? I think there's a lot of, I'll just make this note. There are a lot of questions about, well, some of these things are hypotheses. Yeah, they are. They're scientific hypotheses that we hope studies like ours and others will drive investigation. If it proves wrong, great. But the point is that we need to work together to collect the data.
I mean, I've seen on the chat as well as in the Q&A that, you know, this is a question that comes up.
Yeah.
The way science works is somebody proposes a hypothesis and then, you know, it's tested. And what we did was comb the literature, as not just the marine mammal literature or the cetacean literature, but the human literature, by adding in medical doctor and a psychiatrist, you know, into our author list, you know, and we collaborated, you know, in an what do you call that? In a synergistic way.
Yeah.
In an interdisciplinary way, you know, we collaborated to come up with a model to explain what is in the literature as far as orcas are concerned and as far as other mammals are concerned, including human beings. You know, conservation of mechanisms in mammals and you know, Occam's razor and all of that suggests that, you know, these mechanisms and these should be similar. And so what we would like now is, you know, absolutely populate that model with data. Let's test it. Let's see if it actually is an explanation for everything that is seen in these animals. And again, I can only repeat that, you know, I'm probably one of the people out there outside of the public display community that, you know, knows the most about captive orcas. And I'm, you know, in some ways in the dark, because there's an enormous body of data, of archived data, I hope it's archived, on these animals over the last 50 years that has not been published in the literature. And we would love to see it published in the literature. And to see if the accumulating impacts, you know, that these animals demonstrate fit this model. And as Lori said, maybe they don't. That's the point. What we have so far in the literature is supported by this model. That's why we wrote the paper. But it doesn't mean that if we had more data, especially since there is so much that isn't in the literature, that we would find that it holds up. I think it will, but that's just my opinion, based on what I have seen in the literature. So we're looking for more data. We're looking for, you know, this is just the first step. There are many steps to take. So.
Absolutely, absolutely, and one of the reasons why we've done this webinar is to reach out to others who may have an interest in collaborating, so that we can really understand very deeply what happens to orcas, what happens to cetaceans, what happens to other animals when they're placed in captivity. To say that being in a concrete tank doesn't have any impact on well-being is not a debatable issue anymore. We know that it's not good for them. Now the question becomes, what's not good for them? What can we change? And how can we make life better for them? And that's really what the bottom line is here. For us proposing this model, which we do believe best fits the data that we currently have. If there's data to show that that model doesn't fit for some reason, let's explore it. I will just mention that, you know, someone who has studied dolphin and whale brains for over 30 years, there's a great, and mammal brains in general, there is a great deal of evolutionary conservation in the development and the evolution of brains. So parsimony tells us that, you know, whatever a hypothalamus is doing in a mouse brain or a human brain or a monkey brain, it's also doing that in an orca brain. If you want to make the argument it's doing something completely different than it does in all the other mammals, I would love to see the data, but right now that's not what we have right now. So again, this is about an appeal to come together to explore more of the data than we've had access to. Well,
It's up, it's time, unfortunately.
fine.
It's 10.
So
And thanks for the East Coast folks, or even folks in like Europe or whoever who stayed up to watch this. We really appreciate that.
yes. So again, I want to thank Naomi. I want to thank Veronica. I want to thank all of you for joining us in this all too brief webinar. We're happy, you know where to find us. We're happy to engage in substantive discussion with you about the data and to move forward from there. So thank you very much again, and everyone be well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.